I'm Tom Lanny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at the college. And I'm really grateful to Professor Kassow, who's here tonight. I'll introduce in a minute, to welcome him for a talk titled Time Capsules in the Rubble, the Secret Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. We're pleased to present this talk as part of the Kraft-Hiatt Program for Jewish-Christian Understanding. Through funding from the Kraft and Hiatt families, the McFarland Center has been able to support special opportunities for teaching and learning about the Holocaust, about Jewish life, and about Jewish-Christian relations for many years. You can learn more about our past talks online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, and this talk should be up in a couple of days too for people who miss it. Samuel Kassow was born in a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, Germany, where his parents met after the war. His mother survived because a classmate hid her and her sister in a dugout underneath the barn on his family's farm, while his father was arrested by the Russians and spent the duration of the war in a Soviet prison camp. After a few years, the family emigrated to Connecticut. Today, he's the Charles Northam Professor of History at Trinity College in Hartford and author of Who Will Write Our History? Emanuel Ringelblum, The Warsaw Ghetto, and the Oyneg Shabes Archives, published by Indiana University Press in 2007. The book was a runner-up for the 2007 National Jewish Book Award and won the Orbis Prize for Polish Studies by the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies. An expert on the Ringelblum collection, Professor Kassow served as a consultant for the documentary film version of Who Will Write Our History, set to release this year, and directed by Roberta Grossman and Nancy Spielberg as executive producer. Recently, he edited the books Listen and Believe, The Ghetto Reportage of Peretz Opuszinski and Joseph Zelkovitz, published by Yale University Press in 2015, and with David Roski's The Posen Anthology of Modern Jewish Culture, Volume 9, published by Yale in 2016.
Actually, it's going to be published next year.
Next year.
Next
Sorry.
year.
Okay.
Okay.
So don't buy it yet.
Yeah.
But look for it. He's a consultant to the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, which opened on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, and a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research. So please join me in welcoming Professor Samuel Kassow.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thanks for the invitation to come to Holy Cross. I think the last time I was here was, 15 years ago when Professor Flynn asked me to come and talk about Russia. Can you all hear me? So I want to talk about a very courageous historian, and his name was Emanuel Ringelblum. And on March 1st, 1944, just 1 week before he was caught and executed by the Germans, he wrote one of his last letters to a close friend who, like himself, was hiding in German-occupied Warsaw. And in this letter, Ringelblum asked, if we're caught, if none of us survive to see the end of the war, what will happen to the OS? The OS was code for Oyneg Shabes, which Yiddish for Joy of the Sabbath, which in turn was the code name for the secret archive. And it shows you how obsessed they were with keeping the secret. And Ringelblum had very good reason to worry, because by the time the war was over, of the 60 or so people that Ringelblum had brought into this top secret project of documentation, of those 60 or so people, there were only 3 survivors. And of the 3 survivors, only one, Hirschwasser, knew where the archive had been buried. That is under a Jewish school in the Warsaw Ghetto, Nowolipki 68, in a basement. And that one person who knew where the archive had been buried had himself survived by the slimmest of margins, once jumping from a train, taking him to the death camp in Treblinka. Those 3 survivors, Hirschwasser, his wife, and an amazing woman named Rachel Auerbach, and they all ended up in the Jewish state in Israel, and Rachel Auerbach played a major role in the Eichmann trial, helping to focus the trial on witness testimony rather than on documents, as was the case in the Nuremberg trials. Those three survivors after the war, they begged, they buttonholed, they cajoled everybody they could find. Help us locate this buried treasure that we risked so much to protect. And finally, they got some help from the United States, the Jewish Labor Committee, the Joint Distribution Committee. But, you know, if you've ever seen a picture of what Warsaw looked like in 1945 and 1946, it was literally just a pile of rubble. After the Jewish uprising in April and May 1943, and then after the Polish uprising of August to October 1944, where 200,000 people were killed, there was very little left of Warsaw, except the extreme north and the extreme south, and it was hard to even know where a street had been, much less where a particular building had been. But using the fact that the spire of a Catholic church remains standing, using pre-war aerial photographs, and bringing together a team of engineers and surveyors, and embarking on what Auerbach called an archaeological expedition, they finally started to dig in the rubble on the spot where these surveyors guessed, based on the pre-war aerial photographs, where Novolipki 68 must have been. And they dug, and finally on September 18th, 1946, a shovel hit the first of what turned out to be 10 tin boxes. And these tin boxes were part of the first cache of the archive, which had been buried on the night of August 3rd, 1942. And here you see Hirschwasser with his back to you, and the guy in the mustache is Michal Borvich, who is handing one of those tin boxes to Hirschwasser. Now, I said that Hirschwasser survived by a slim margin. The guy in the mustache, Michal Borvich, who became a distinguished scholar of Holocaust literature after the war in Paris, he survived, I would say, by an even slimmer margin, because in the Janowska labor camp near Lvov in 1943, he was actually hanged. Yes, he was hanged, but the rope broke, and the SS man, you know, being a gentleman, as so many of them were, he was, you know, university graduate, Marburg, I think it was. He didn't believe in hanging people twice. And so the rope broke, fair's fair, and he let Borvich back into the general prison population. Then Borvich escaped. So these two people are unearthing those tin boxes. Now Wasser is saying, hey, we buried a lot more than this. This is just a little bit. But they searched and searched. They couldn't find anything more. And by the way, a lot of water had seeped into the tin boxes. Thousands of the photographs were ruined. Many documents that had been written in ink were spoiled. But that was that. And they couldn't find anything else. And then Wasser and Auerbach and most of the other Jewish scholars left for the new Jewish state. Things in Poland were getting more communist, more regimented, and years went by. And then in December 1950, Polish construction workers nearby, building new apartment houses on what had been the former ghetto, stumbled on two aluminum milk cans. And these aluminum milk cans, that's Rachel Auerbach and that's Hirschwasser with the tin boxes. And these are the aluminum milk cans. Actually, we owe them to a Polish building foreman. The workers saw the milk cans. They thought, well, the former ghetto, they must be stuffed with money, gold, watches. You know how rich those Jews were. Well, when they found documents, they were going to throw it all away. But the foreman said, no, this is probably valuable for history, and he took it to the Jewish Historical Institute. His name was Wojciech. Those milk cans were buried in February 1943, and they were the second cache of the Oyneg Shabes that was buried. Now, a week before the outbreak of the ghetto uprising, in April 1943, and the ghetto uprising began the first day of Passover, they buried a third cache on Świętojerska 34. And that cache was never found. Had it been found, it would have told us quite a lot about the preparations for resistance. And over time, that cache became the site of the Chinese embassy in Poland, which it is today. And a few years ago, Israeli searchers, one of whom I knew, asked the Chinese for permission to dig under their embassy to look for these hidden documents, and the Chinese graciously allowed them to do it, but they couldn't find anything. So much of the Oyneg Shabes has not been found. Nonetheless, we have 25 to 30,000 documents and artifacts. And just a few years ago, when the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum published a volume, a catalog, just for these documents, the catalog came to 500 pages. The archive is now being published in Warsaw by the Jewish Historical Institute. It's running to 36 volumes. And this is just a fraction of what they had originally buried. Now, the question that you might want to ask is, why is this important? And who cares? And it goes to the title of my book, Who Will Write Our History? The Germans thought they would win the war, and they would write the history of the Jews, and they would control how the Jews would be remembered. Now, there was a Jewish historian, Isaac Schipper, who shortly before he was murdered in Majdanek in 1943 said something that you should think about. He said the following: what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. And, then the Germans presented the Jews as rats and vermin and, carriers of disease. And the Germans sent film crews into the ghetto to film Jews in all kinds of humiliating situations. And the Jews knew this. And they basically said to themselves, even if they kill us, we will leave time capsules buried in the ground so that even from beyond the grave, we will be able to have some say over how we're remembered. And we will write our history, not the Germans. So to write in 1942 was an act of great optimism. Remember, it was in 1942 that 85% of Polish Jewry was murdered. And at that same time, the Germans were winning the war. And if you thought the Germans were going to win the war, then why bother to write? So the act of writing was a show that no matter what you believed, that ultimately justice would prevail. In short, you could resist, not just with guns. Very few people had access to guns. You could resist with paper and pen. And in some ways, in the long run, that was just as effective. And Jews believed in using paper and pen. The great Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, as he was being led to his execution in Riga in 1941, he was 81 years old. His last words were, "Jews, write it all down." Under the ruins of crematorium number 3 in Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1945 and 1946, we found glass bottles stuffed with the Yiddish writings of 2 rabbis who had been in the Sonderkommando, that group that had to take Jews into the gas chamber, drag the bodies out, and burn the bodies. Under the ruins of the Vilna Ghetto, we found a diary by Hermann Kruk, the last entry only 4 hours before he was shot. When Yale published that diary, it ran to more than 600 pages. In a death cell in Krakow, in the Montepelch prison, a young Jewish woman, Justynia Dranger, wrote a journal on toilet paper. And that journal was published some years ago by University of Massachusetts Press. It's an incredible read. And there were also organized ghetto archives in Łódź, Lodz in Yiddish, in Vilna, in Białystok. But the Oyneg Shabes archive that Ringelblum founded was by far the biggest. It was the biggest project of documentation, Jewish or non-Jewish, in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. That is illegal documentation. And it was, you might say, one of the most important projects of what we would call civil resistance in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. If resistance is defined in the widest sense of the term, that is, the Germans want to do A, and by fighting that, you are resisting. If they want to control your memory, you thwart that. If they want to humiliate you, by doing anything that thwarts that purpose, that in and of itself is an act of resistance. So the Oyneg Shabes was different in many ways. First of all, it was a collective. As I said, 60 people. Orthodox rabbis like Shimon Huberband, working side by side with communists like Yehuda Feld, leaders of the anti-Zionist Jewish Labor Bund, working side by side with Zionists like Lipa Bloch, men and women, young and old, the famous and the not so famous. It was also very well organized. There was an executive committee that met every Saturday afternoon. They charted strategy. They decided who to co-opt. They decided money matters. They were the ones who kept the archive going. There was a group of interviewers who literally took their lives in their hands because they were the ones who would go into the refugee centers where the Germans literally dumped more than 100,000 Jews from other parts of Poland. These centers, you had 1,000, 1,500 people living without hot water, without sanitation. They were covered with lice. These interviewers knew that they could very easily get typhus and die, and many of them did, but they did their job, and they got information, therefore, not just from Warsaw, but from the other parts of pre-war Poland. There were copiers. Ringelblum didn't have a Xerox machine, so they had to make hand copies of 2 or 3 times of each document. There was what was called an executive committee of one teacher, Israel Lichtenstein, and 2 teenage boys, 17 years old, one 17, one 19, and only they, plus Ringelblum, plus Wasser, and Eliyahu Gutkowski, only 6 people knew where the documents actually were located. So even if a member of the Oyneg Shabes was caught and tortured, the odds were they would not be able to give away the secret. Now, what made the Oyneg Shabes so effective is that it was wrapped into, it was effectively camouflaged by being inside a big organization in the Warsaw Ghetto called the Alleinhilfe, or the self-help. The self-help helped run soup kitchens, refugee centers, schools, daycare centers. And the thing to remember about the self-help is that it was funded partly by a Jewish organization in the U.S., the Joint Distribution Committee. Germany and the U.S. were not at war until December 1941. So until then, the Alleinhilfe had a kind of a legal status in the eyes of the Germans. That served to provide money, to provide cover for gathering information without arousing suspicion. The archive was also different in certain other ways. The sheer ambition and scope of its agenda. The first agenda item, which lasted right up until the very end, was to sammel, to collect, as they say in Yiddish. They collected candy wrappers. They collected the menus from the fancy restaurants in the ghetto. Yes, there were fancy restaurants in the ghetto where policemen and smugglers and speculators and Gestapo agents fed their faces. They collected doorbell instructions. If 6, 7 families are living in one apartment, Ringelblum thought the doorbell instructions might give future readers a sense of what it means to live in crowded conditions when 10 people are living in a room. There were children's essays, and there were the instructions that the Judenrat issued for how to cook the rotten frozen potatoes that the Germans gave to the ghetto as part of the official ration. In 1941, the Oyneg Shabes embarked on a new project to study Jewish life under the German occupation. Now, keep in mind, they still don't know that the Germans are going to kill everybody. They're thinking about usable knowledge for the post-war period. And they come up with 80 different topics: women, children, corruption, religious life, Jewish-Polish relations. They intended to publish this, publish in the relative sense, in a book of 1,600 pages. Each topic had a team leader, and some members of the Oyneg Shabes were team leaders of 5 or 6 topics. Each topic had questionnaires and guidelines and so on. Keep in mind that the executive committee of the Oyneg Shabes, many of them like Ringelblum, were members of a pre-war organization called the YIVO, Y-I-V-O. It was an organization founded in Vilna in 1925 to encourage Jews, scholars and ordinary people, to look at themselves, to know themselves, to study their real lives. Now, Jews in Poland were a despised minority in the eyes of many Poles, and Jewish young people especially were told that they were less, that they were not as good, and many suffered from real psychological problems. The director of the YIVO, Max Weinreich, went to Yale in 1931-32. And he went down to African-American colleges like Tuskegee and Morehouse, and he asked himself, what is the African-American community in the United States doing to give their young people at a time of Jim Crow, to give them self-respect, to give them the psychological armor to defend themselves against insults and against constant reminders of second-class citizenship. And he took those lessons back with him to Poland. And this idea of involving young people and ordinary people in the study of their own lives became a major function of the YIVO. And you might say that in many ways the Oyneg Shabes was a continuation of the YIVO in the Warsaw Ghetto. Again, they didn't know about the mass killing. When they started this, they thought, we will learn lessons that will be useful after the war. This project was in full swing when, on July 22nd, 1942, the SS barged into the offices of Adam Chernyakov, the head of the Warsaw Jewish Council, and said, beginning today, 7,000 to 10,000 Jews will be deported to the east. Between July 22nd and September 12th, 300,000 Jews were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to the gas chambers of Treblinka. That last week of July, Ringelblum sent his 2 secretaries to all of the members of the archive, saying, hand over all your unfinished material, hand over all your notes, hand over all your essays now. Don't worry if it's not finished, we're burying it now. And this was much of that first cache, which was buried in the tin boxes on August 3rd, 1942. Now the archive began to cope with living in hell. The 60 quickly became 50, 40, 30. During that summer, Ringelblum's handwriting changes. He can't complete a sentence. You could tell that he's under incredible psychological strain. He's torn between his feelings as a father and a husband to protect his wife and son and his sense of responsibility to the archive. You could tell he's on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But they kept on working. Even Abraham Lewin, who came home to find that his wife and daughter had been taken away. And he survived until January. But they kept on working. And you might ask, why did they bother when their whole world was now collapsing all around them? And a partial answer can be seen in an essay that was found in one of the milk cans. This essay was written by a socialist woman, Gustawa Jarecka. She wrote in Polish. She was the mother of two. She was a stenographer in the Judenrat, the Jewish council. So with her Judenrat pass, Ringelblum thought she'd be safe from being picked up on the street, and he asked her to walk through the streets of the ghetto and write down everything she saw. And she managed to write the first part of an amazing essay before she and her two kids were taken to Treblinka. And in this essay, in part, Gustawa Jarecka said, you know, how could you blame us Jews for having believed that the story of history is a story of moral progress, that it's a story of man's improvement from barbarism to decency? How could we have known that the most educated and cultured nation in Europe would be murdering children on the streets in 1942? How could we have known that the direction of history is in fact towards barbarism and towards murder? And therefore, and now I'm quoting her directly, I hope that these writings will serve someday as a stone under history's wheel. That is, if history's wheel is grinding in the direction of savagery and murder, maybe someday somebody will find those writings and say, oh my God, how could this have happened? How could we have stood by and allowed this genocide to happen? Let's make sure it never happens again. And so she had that sense that those writings, if someday they saw the light of day, they might have an impact. During the course of 1942, 6 escapees from the death camps of Chelmno, 1 escapee from Chelmno, 5 from Treblinka, appeared in the Warsaw Ghetto. And they were taken in hand by Hirschwasser of the Oyneg Shabes, and with suitable camouflage, they were interviewed about what they saw. So these were the first ever eyewitness reports of the mass killings in the death camps. And the one such interview alone with Avram Kshepitsky, who spent 11 days in Treblinka in August and September 42, one of those interviews ran to more than 100 typed pages in Yiddish. During the course of 1942, the Oyneg Shabes incorporated those interviews and a lot of other material into 4 reports, which they sent to London through the channels of the Polish underground government. All those reports reached London. The last report, sent in November 1942, contained a detailed map of Treblinka in real time while Treblinka was still killing 15,000 people a day. And it even contained the detail that the colors of the tiles inside the gas chambers was orange. And that level of detail reached Britain by the end of 1942. Ringelblum's watchword was, and he wrote this in Yiddish, zu verschreiben, to write it down, und zu verschreiben nach der heißer Minute, to write everything down immediately. Don't wait. Don't wait until tomorrow because it's war. You don't know if you'll be alive tomorrow, and you don't know what kind of a person you'll be tomorrow. And don't decide what's important and what's not important. Let future historians sort that out. Everything you see, write it down. In other words, Ringelblum had this innate sense, and he was a trained historian. He had a PhD in history, and he was also interested in what today we call Alltagsgeschichte, history of everyday life, the Annals School, and so on. That's all in my book. But Ringelblum had this innate sense that the testimony of people in real time in a community that's not yet destroyed is going to be very different from survivor testimony after the war. Survivors after the war, they're going to look back and they're going to have a totally different take on what they went through. Let's take, for an example, Cecilia Slapakova. Cecilia Slapakova was a woman who Ringelblum asked to direct the study of Jewish women in wartime Poland. And she was very enthusiastic. She interviewed many women, ranging from a librarian, a PhD in biology, all the way to a woman who organized a bordello, to a woman who smuggled vegetables into the ghetto. And she even began the first part of her introductory essay, which she completed before she and her daughter were gassed in Treblinka. And in this introductory essay, Slapakova said, you know, it's amazing, 2.5 years of war have shown that women have much more psychological resilience than men. They're less prone to depression, they're less prone to apathy, and as the ghetto has dragged on, more and more of the burden of keeping the schools, the soup kitchens going has fallen on women. And this, I must say, she said, when this war is over, I am sure that the Jewish woman in Poland will not allow herself to be pushed back into the kitchen. She will demand an equal place at the table. Now, let's assume that Slapakova was not murdered. Let's assume that she'd survived the war, like so many other survivors, met a new husband, had a new family, maybe living in Boston. She gives an interview to the Spielberg Foundation when she's in her 70s or 80s. The Warsaw Ghetto would no longer be remembered by her. It would be a mere holding pen for the death camps. That she was once thinking about Jewish women in post-war Poland, she probably would have forgotten that. She would have dwelt on how she survived, on how individuals made it through the war. And Ringelblum understood that. And so that perspective of a community that was still a community, that was not yet destroyed, that's incredibly valuable for historians, because we understand the Jews not as faceless victims, but as real people. So what were some of these last voices? June 1942, an essay contest in all the schools in the ghetto, written by kids 13, 14, 15. What do I want to be when the war is over? The Divrei Torah, the Sabbath sermons of one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, the Piaseczner Rebbe, Kalonymus Shapiro. And you could see the evolution of this rabbi's thought as his sermons changed from 1940 to 1942, as he's asking, why is this disaster befalling the Jewish people? All of his writings were in the Oyneg Shabes archive. The prosaic note taken by an ordinary woman, a Mrs. Kaplan, calling together Mrs. Cohn, Mrs. Weinstein, other members of her house committee, to sit down and make up a list of kids in the building who aren't getting fed, and to try to match them up with better off families in the building who might be able to give them a little extra food. The writings of a ghetto mailman, Peretz Opachinsky, and that's part of the book that just came out this past year. And he's describing how at the height of the deportations in September 42, on a hot, sunny day, the Germans put a couch in the middle of a street, and there are a few toddlers on this couch crying for their parents. And any Jews who go up to the couch to try to feed these kids are brutally beaten. And Opachinsky says, why did the Germans put it there? Just so we Jews could suffer just a little bit more, just a little bit more. And then there's something else that was found in the milk cans. And this would never, I think, have been written had the writer survived the war. There was a Yiddish writer called Shia Perle who was murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. But in August 1942, he walked by a horrible scene. A Jewish policeman was dragging a little kid, maybe 5 years old, to his SS handler and said, "This is my 5th head of the day." The Jewish police had to catch 5 Jews a day because they thought that that would save their skins and save their families. And the Germans would check it off. Okay, you've gotten your 5. And some Jewish policemen would catch 8 or 9 people and then sell the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th to fellow policemen. And the SS man looked at this little boy that was trying to break free from the policeman's grasp, and he calmly took out his pistol and shot the boy. And as the boy was dying on the pavement, the SS man said, "This little dog doesn't count as a head. Go get me an adult." And Perla described how the policeman scampered off to look for an adult. And Perla came back and wrote something that he never would have written after the war. What did he say? How could a people produce such bastards as the Jewish police? Maybe a people that can produce such scum is a people that deserves everything it's getting. Now, after the war, this white-hot anger against other Jews, which was so characteristic of wartime writing, that disappeared. The murdered Jews were either resistance heroes or they were martyrs, the 6 million martyrs. You didn't say anything bad about them. And surely Perla himself would not have said that. But then you could ask another question. This was found in the milk can. So why did Ringelblum put it into the milk can? He could have torn it up because this doesn't make Jews look good, does it? But Ringelblum really was somebody who had total contempt for what we call today alternative facts. Ringelblum really believed in facts. He believed in truth. He believed that posterity will respect him and his comrades only if they know that they were honest, that the archive contained every perspective and every possible detail. Only then would it have authority. And that meant talking about the collaboration and talking about the police and touching on that. But Ringelblum also believed that if that's included, then historians hopefully will dig deeper and get at what he called the real story. And the real story in Ringelblum's mind was not the collaboration or the demoralization, but what he called das stille Heldentum von dem jüdischen Massenmensch, the quiet heroism of the ordinary Jew. Keep in mind that these people were dying. These people were watching their families murdered. These people were watching their people destroyed. And they didn't have even the comfort of knowing, as survivors saw after the war, that there would be a Jewish state in 1948. All they knew was that everything was collapsing. The anger, the bitterness, the depression. And Ringelblum was trying to cope with that, saying this is the silver line. The ordinary Jews helping each other, trying to keep it together, people who had no money, who didn't have any Polish, who were simply sent to the death camps. Let the archive tell their story, and it's an amazing story. Now, who was Emanuel Ringelblum? Sometimes, this is Ringelblum as a young man. He was born in a little town in Galicia in 1900. He was a cousin of the great Israeli writer Shai Agnon, who got the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1966. If you're born in 1900, what kind of generation do you belong to if you're Jewish? It means that the week that he turned 17, two big things happened. One was the Balfour Declaration, where the British said there would be a Jewish national home in Palestine. The other was the Bolshevik Revolution. And for this generation growing up in interwar Poland, where they were discriminated against and treated as second-class citizens, they held on to politics and ideology as an anchor, as a source of hope. Many became communists, many became Zionists, many became socialists. And Ringelblum was no exception. He really threw himself into radical politics, and he joined an extreme left-wing political party called the Left Labor Zionists, who, this is complicated, so I'm not going to explain it, but this party wanted a binational, Yiddish-speaking Soviet Palestine. Don't ask. We can talk about it later. But now, these political parties had no hope of ever gaining power. But it's where you met your spouse. It's where you had your friends. It was an alternative universe. And Ringelblum met his wife, in the party. They had one son, Yuri, who Ringelblum absolutely doted on. He was the apple of his eye. He had to work a lot of jobs to make ends meet. One of those jobs was being a teacher at an upper-crust Jewish private school for girls, where the language of instruction was Polish. And I tracked down one of his students who lived then in Queens, and she said, you know, Dr. Ringelblum, he'd always come in a little bit late, a little disheveled. You know, we girls like to make fun of him. And when we had an exam, if we wanted extra time to study, one of us would raise her hand and say, Dr. Ringelblum, yeah, you haven't talked about your son for a while. How's he doing? And Ringelblum will pull out his wallet and show pictures and brag about his son. Then they have an extra day to study for a test. Being in that political party really animated Ringelblum, and it gave him a deep commitment to poor people, a deep commitment to politics, and a deep commitment to Yiddish. This was the only Zionist party that was pro-Yiddish, the language of ordinary Jews, rather than pro-Hebrew. The second hat that Ringelblum wore was as a community organizer, and he helped organize microcredit in Poland in the 1930s, which played a very important role in helping Jews avoid boycotts and keep their heads above water. And the third hat he wore was as a historian. That was his first love. He got his PhD in history from Warsaw University in 1926. And Jewish historians in Poland saw themselves not just as scholars, but as soldiers, fighters. Polish historians were publishing books to show that Jews traditionally were responsible for Poland's fall. They had kept Poland from developing a middle class, building cities. Jews were aliens. They were not wanted. Jewish historians had to show in their books that Jews had built the country, that Jews had lived there as long as the Poles, that they'd fought for the country, and they were there by right as well as by sufferance. But Ringelblum also saw himself as a soldier vis-a-vis Jews. Because being a Marxist and being very left-wing, Ringelblum had no patience for a view of Jewish history which saw Jewish history as a story of rabbis and poor people and rich people all holding hands and going to the synagogue to pray. He wanted social history. He was very much influenced by Marxist history and by the Annales School, by material history. He wanted to study the forgotten members of Jewish society, women, the poor, apprentices, beggars. To do that kind of history, you couldn't do it by studying Talmudic commentaries. You needed a new kind of material, which meant that you had to go into towns and villages and gather documents. And this was what he did in the 20s and 30s. This is what the YIVO did. And this ethos of gathering documents as a national mission segued into the Oyneg Shabes archive. For a long time, he couldn't believe that the Polish Jews were doomed. He held on to every scrap of hope. In June 1942, he wrote in his diary, "Today is a great day." Why was it a great day? Because that day, the BBC, the British radio, announced that 700,000 Polish Jews had been killed by the Germans. So why is that great? Because that was the number that Ringelblum had sent to London just a few weeks before. That was proof that the report had reached London and that it was being used by the BBC. Now, being a Marxist, Ringelblum said, well, now that it's no longer secret, all these Germans in the Wehrmacht, all these ordinary Germans who voted for the Communist Party and the SPD, the socialists, now they're going to rise up and say, we will not allow this crime to be committed in our name. The German people will put their foot down and stop this. Because he refused to believe that anti-Semitism was baked in the cake or baked into people's DNA. And of course, it didn't happen, but it shows you what he was thinking. On the fourth day of the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto, in April 1943, he was caught by the Germans, sent to the labor camp in Travniki, from which he made a very daring escape, which I describe in my book. And in August 43, he winds up in South Warsaw in an underground hideout with 37 other Jews, including his wife and son. 2 people left the hideout and wound up in Israel after the war, at the Weizmann Institute, and I spoke to them. They said it was hell. Darkness, terrible air, people fighting, people getting on each other's nerves, fear. And at night, we'd go up one by one to get 5 minutes of air. And in a corner, Ringelblum sat by the light of a carbide lamp, and he just wrote page after page. He literally wrote thousands of pages in those last few months of his life. And once a week, a courier, Von der Rottenberg, who I interviewed in Israel in the 90s, she would give him more paper and more ink and take away what he wrote. And he wrote about the Jewish writers and poets and activists who were killed. He wrote about resistance. And it was in that bunker that he also wrote his masterpiece. He wrote a book called Polish-Jewish Relations in the Second World War. Now, when we think about writing a book, we apply for a fellowship. We, get a graduate assistant if we're lucky. We go to archives. We get money for Xeroxing. Ringelblum wrote this book in that bunker by the light of the carbide lamp, and that book was good enough so that it was translated into English and published by Northwestern University Press in 1992. Now, imagine the moral pressure that Ringelblum was under. How can you be a historian while at the same time you're a victim? How can you be an objective historian as you've witnessed one of the worst crimes in the history of mankind? How do you keep from getting emotional and just, erupting in a scream of pain? But he was determined to be a scholar. And he believed that he had this crushing responsibility, that he was the last Jewish historian left alive in Poland, that 8 centuries of 2 peoples, Poles and Jews, living side by side, sharing the same land, was now ending in hatred and murder and bitterness. And he felt that he had to get it right. And so in the introduction to this study, he wrote something that might strike us as quite strange. He compared himself to a sofer. A sofer is a scribe who writes a Torah scroll. And Ringelblum said, I feel like I'm a sofer. I'm writing a Torah scroll. And before I write this, I should go to a mikvah. I should go to a ritual bath and purify myself. And I know that if I make one mistake, the whole document will be worthless. I have to get it all right. And he was somebody who was determined to rise up over his emotions and get it right. And he began by saying, let's shoot down some stereotypes and unfounded prejudices. There are many Jews who believe that the entire Polish nation wanted nothing more than to see us all killed, and that they hate us and they want us all dead. I can say, Ringelblum says, that's not true. Poles are risking their lives to save me, and not all Poles are the way most Jews think they are. But then he went out of his way to set the historical record straight. And before he did that, he paid tribute to the Polish people, their courage, their love of country. He paid tribute to the risks they were taking in the underground. He said the Holocaust was started by the Germans, and the Germans are so obsessed with killing every single Jew that even if the Poles were nicer to us, unless the war ends very soon, most of us who are still in hiding will sooner or later be caught and killed. But having said that, and having pointed out the fact that if Germans caught Poles hiding a Jew, they executed them, and 750 Poles were executed, and that included the father of a boy who tried to save my mom. Actually, she hid for only a relatively short time because they were denounced by a neighbor. And then she went through all kinds of adventures. After saying that, Ringelblum then got down to brass tacks. He says, okay, the fact is, though, that Poles will take great risks for Poland, but it is morally and socially unacceptable to help Jews, for the most part. And if Poles are helping Jews, the biggest risks they face are from their Polish neighbors. And Ringelblum then said, just 2 weeks ago I heard, that when the Germans were chasing a fleeing Polish resistance fighter through the streets of occupied Warsaw, all they had to do was yell, "Catch the Jew, catch the Jew." And Poles came out from the crowd to catch this fleeing Pole. Had the Germans asked the Poles, "Catch this fleeing Polish fighter," the whole crowd would have helped the fighter escape. And Ringelblum said that was the problem, that by and large, it was socially unacceptable to help the Jewish population, and the Polish underground, the Polish Home Army, treated the Jews not as citizens of Poland, but as unwanted aliens. On March 7th, 1944, an informer led the Gestapo to the hideout. And all the 37 Jews and 2 Poles were taken into a truck and sent to the Pawiak prison. In Detroit, not long ago, a man came up to me after this talk and said, I was a little Jewish boy, I was 8, 9 years old, and we were on Aryan papers, and our apartment overlooked that site where the Jews were loaded onto the truck. And I'll never forget that. So he saw Ringelblum being loaded onto the truck. So they were all taken to the Pawiak prison. And there was an inmate in the Pawiak prison, Yechiel Hirschau, who said, he survived the war, said when we heard that Ringelblum was taken into the prison, we racked our brains. How can we save him? Maybe we could pay off German guards. We can bribe the SS men. And, maybe we can get him into another cell and kind of help him that way. And so Hirschau went into Ringelblum's cell. And Ringelblum had been badly beaten, black and blue, and his son was sitting on his lap. And Hirschau outlined his scheme, and Ringelblum said, no, I'm not going to leave my wife and son. And Hirschau said he couldn't save them. And on March 10th, and the last words that Hirschau remembers Ringelblum saying is, "Was ist auch schuldig, der Kleine," pointing at his son, "Zu liebem weet ich mir stark das Haus." Why is this little one guilty? Because of this little boy, my heart is breaking. On March 10th, all the Jews and the 2 Poles were shot next to the prison. And so I want to end this talk by going back to that night of August 3rd, 1942, when Israel Lichtenstein and those 2 teenagers were burying the first cache of the archive. And they were writing their last wills and testaments. And by that time, the Germans had already deported 100,000 people. And the SS were only 50 yards away. And when the Germans would get closer, they'd say, "This is it, goodbye." And then when they go farther away, they'd write some more. And amazingly, all those last wills and testaments survived in the tin boxes. And Israel Lichtenstein wrote, "I've given my whole life to this archive. I want to be remembered. My name is Israel Lichtenstein. My wife's name is Gela Sexstein. She's a talented artist. She designed sets for the Children's Theater in the Warsaw Ghetto. I want my daughter Margalit to be remembered. She's 20 months old, but she equals 4-year-old children in intelligence. And my heart breaks for this little child." And I believe, he ended his testament by writing, "I believe that we, the Jews of Eastern Europe, are a redeeming sacrifice for the Jewish people. The Jewish people will survive." And so in his last months, Lichtenstein reminded us that the Jews were not anonymous, faceless victims. They were individuals with names and with lives. And they were also members of a vibrant and resilient people. And this was the real legacy of the Oyneg Shabes archive. Thank you. the status of the Yiddish language. Well, you know, it's funny. Many people believed that it was a murdered language, that the Germans had murdered not just the Jews, but the language. Most of the victims of the Holocaust were native Yiddish speakers. But now, in the ultra-religious communities in New York and in Israel, more and more of these ultra-religious people are raising their kids in Yiddish. And so the number of Yiddish speakers is actually going up. Now, for people like Ringelblum, Yiddish was something that was associated with the left. It was the language of the workers. It was the language of the poor. It was, unlike Hebrew, a language of the masses and not a language of elites. That era of secular Yiddish, which produced such great writers as Chaim Grada, Bashevis Singer, Avram Sutzkever, the poet, that era is probably gone forever. Although Yiddish is alive and well in universities, at Harvard, at Columbia, at Berkeley, there are chairs of Yiddish literature. I just came back from a conference in Ann Arbor where there's a very strong Yiddish department. Yiddish is taught in Polish university. But in terms of a spoken language, it's mainly spoken now in the ultra-Orthodox world. Well, he didn't comment on that in the official historical record. He did write a lot about that in his letters to Adolf Berman. And he wrote about how his wife suffered from depression and fear, how his son was having emotional problems, how they were trying to keep him focused on studying. Von der Rotenberg would come with textbooks. They would tutor him. But he was very, very worried. And again, the conditions were absolutely horrible, and yet they were very lucky because they were alive. And but it was a very difficult emotional burden. In December 1943, he had a chance to leave the bunker with his wife and son and go to Hungary. And at that time, Hungary was not under German occupation. Jews were persecuted, but they weren't being killed. But Ringelblum said, no, I have to stay here. He really felt that he had a final mission and that he couldn't simply turn his back on that mission. And the kind of history that he wrote in those last months, you could see that he was pouring his heart and soul into it. And one of the strategies he used was to choose individuals and write short biographies of individuals that he knew, but in the process using those biographies to touch on basic historical problems, like Jewish resistance through his essay on Mordechai Anilevich, the 22-year-old commander of the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto. The problems of doing Jewish history through his essays on Schipper and Balaban, two older Jewish historians before the war who both died in World War II. Yitzchak Gitterman to write about the problems of self-help in the ghetto. So he was really writing a very important history of Polish Jewry during the war, focused on individuals. And then, of course, he wrote that book, Polish-Jewish Relations. And he had incredible discipline. And I just want to add something else. You know, there's not enough time to talk about it here, but Ringelblum believed that historians should not just be scholars. He believed, and he believed this before the war, that one of the key jobs of a historian is to be an organizer and a facilitator, to put together bibliographies, to popularize history, to work in museums, to get lay people interested in writing the history of their towns and their families. And some people looked down on him before the war. Oh, he's not really a scholar. He's more of an organizer, even though he did write 4 books. Having only an hour a day to work in the archives, he did write 4 books by the time he was 39. But he believed that the job of a historian is to facilitate the work of other historians. A shipper or a balaban would never have organized the Oyneg Shabes. Ringelblum did that because of his conception of what the historian's craft consisted of, and had Marc Bloch, the great French historian who was executed by the Germans, survived the war, and had Ringelblum survived the war, they would have had a fascinating conversation about the historian's craft, the title of one of Bloch's last books, and I would have loved to have overheard that conversation. Again, that's the kind of remark, that's the kind of questioning that survivors would not have cared about. You know, if you went through Auschwitz and labor camps and death marches, were you going to care about, you know, what women did in 1941? It would have vanished from your radar screen. But because you're living it in real time in 1941, you care about it quite a lot. And from the point of view of historians, that's valuable information. Well, the reception, there's been an incredible reception in France and in Germany where they really get it. And there have been a lot of discussions, and you know the book has been translated into 8 languages, and so there the reception has been really good because these are countries where people still like to read, and where books are reviewed, where there are literary supplements to newspapers that people take seriously. And so, you know, the book has been discussed on TV when the book came out, when it was translated. I think the reception in Israel has been good. The book has been translated into Hebrew. Here, it took a little while. And in terms of the reception, I think that it's getting where it's getting the best reception is from historians who were teaching graduate students. And they assign the book to graduate students of history, and they say that the book really works, that it works well in seminars. And so I think that's where it's probably having the most interest. There's a big medical archive, but it's not part of the Oyneg Shabes. There was medical research conducted by Jewish doctors. Israel Milikovsky played a big role in that. Israel Milikovsky was interviewed for the Oyneg Shabes and so on. But because Israel Milikovsky, a doctor who was murdered in 1943, because he was on the Judenrat, Ringelblum was so obsessed with secrecy that basically anybody on the Judenrat was not let into the secret of the archive, with one exception, Shmuel Winter, who Ringelblum knew before the war. And so this medical research on starvation, especially, and on typhus and so on, this was basically given over to Polish doctors who hid it. And there's a very interesting book written on that by Dr. Rowland, Charles Rowland, about this medical research in the Warsaw Ghetto. Well, Ringelblum interacted with Milikovsky quite a lot. But Ringelblum did not want to do anything that might compromise the secrecy, and he. It's not that he thought Milikovsky was dishonest. He didn't tell Schipper about the archive, even though Schipper was his teacher, because he was just afraid that an incautious remark dropped at the wrong time might compromise everything. By the way, that whole issue of medical resistance during the war is a very important issue. And there's a doctor, Mark Dvorzhetsky, who survived the Vilna Ghetto and then different concentration camps, who wrote in Yiddish and in Hebrew about the efforts of doctors to fight against epidemics. Now, this was really a matter of life and death. For example, in the Kaunas Ghetto, on October 4th, 1941, when the Germans heard that there was typhus in the Jewish hospital, they surrounded the hospital, locked the doors, and burned all the doctors, nurses, and patients alive. And it was often a fear that if the Germans heard about typhoid or about contagious diseases in the ghetto, they would simply kill everybody. So in ghettos like Vilna and in Bialystok, one, you had to isolate people with typhus and keep the news from getting out. And two, you had to really wage a war for sanitation at a time when it was very difficult to have hot water to wash. It was a heroic struggle. Okay.